Bonjour. My name is Maingan. I am the host of Niche Vibes, and we're here trying to get a chance to know people who work at the university and beyond. And hopefully, we'll be able to build relationships. That's kind of the idea of Niche Vibes. It's to build an understanding of people that work here and hopefully create, more friends and opportunities to work together. I think that's one thing that happens at organizations. We kind of get stuck in our world sometimes, and we don't get a chance to branch out as much. And there's some great people, that work at this university. So I'm new to the university, rather new, and we've been trying to let people know about what we're doing and building indigenous knowledge at the university and find out what everybody else is doing too. So it's a good way to interact and build some allies and friendships. And that's the way it is. So I want to thank you all for joining us. We'll start our interview with a gentleman who I met a few times here at the university, and we've been able to see each other through different functions that happens here. So they call you Father Raff, I hear.
That's
Okay.
right.
I know it's probably a longer term. I don't know, however you want to be called, but you can call me Maingan. I'm the Indigenous Knowledge Keeper for the Faculty of Health, but I do work throughout the whole university on Indigenous initiatives such as convocation and other ceremonies that take place here. So it's nice to have you, and I appreciate you taking some time to come and visit us today.
And thank you for inviting me. It's good to see you again. I think the last time I saw you it was we moved the things to the Friday because Truth and Reconciliation Day was on a Saturday. So we had like the communion ceremony and then there was the walk. So I saw you there like from a distance. I was like, oh, I know that guy.
But were you at the Pope event
Yeah, so
too?
that's actually where we met. Yeah, I
Yes.
remember. I think my understanding, and you can tell me the story of how it was. I think did you reach out to Peter Meehan or Dr. Meehan, or did he reach out to you? I'm not sure how it worked, and you guys decided to have like a kind of joint viewing event.
I think we both kind of we were wondering what we should do with that event, and I can't remember if Peter got a hold of me or I got a hold of him, but we thought it would have been a good place to have this event and invite people to hear what the Pope has to say. And the apologies was really important, so we thought we would have it there, and it worked out really well. So that's where I met you,
Yeah.
and I know you were a little nervous about joining us. I remember you even asked me if you should be there, and I really appreciate that because the topic of the day was very sensitive to many people. Even today, we still have some people who always comfortable, with how the history went and who participated in that. But I kind of think going forward, need to have an understanding with each other so that we can build reconciliation. That won't happen unless we get a chance to know each other and to talk about things, even if the past wasn't very great when it comes to residential school. So I appreciated that, taking the time to come and join us.
Yeah, I remember. I think I saw it in an email. And I thought, oh, I should probably be at this. So I'm involved with the campus ministry over at St. Jerome's University. But as I as I said before we started recording, I'm not staff. I don't even have a key fob. So if the doors are locked, I can't get in. But I remember I saw. I was like, I should be present, and it would be good. And I had no idea really what to expect. And so we had like the fire ceremony before. Then we went inside to watch. And actually, the truth be told, I had a meeting to go to after, and I was like, it's gonna look really, really bad if like the priest like walks out. So I was like, guys, I need to stay for this. But I remember, so after the event, which we watched live, which was itself, something. Yeah, I think I said to you maybe before we went in, and I said, hey, listen, Elder Maingan, I just want to let you know, like, if I recognize that my presence the sight of me can be triggering for some people, and maybe they may not feel so comfortable to share my presence. So I'd like to offer that if an individual wants, when we started doing the kind of sharing session after, if they would prefer that I step up for their sharing, I'm totally okay with that. But what you said to me like, has really remained with me ever since. And you said, if we have to do that, we're never going to move forward. And I just really appreciate that. And I also remember when we did sit in the circle, like I kind of sat as far as there are no corners in a circle, but
Right.
in my estimation, it seemed to be the furthest part away from the center. And actually, people all sat down. And when you came in, there was only one spot left. It was next to me. You sat next to me, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you for your graciousness. I appreciated that.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming, and I guess that could be the foundation of what we're speaking about a little bit today. But in order to let people know who you are, maybe tell us about your background. Are you from this region, and how you got into involvement with the university, or anything you'd like to share about yourself?
Sure, sure. So you introduced me. My name is, everyone called me Father Raf, but my full name is Raphael. So I'm Canadian born Chinese. My family's from Hong Kong originally. I was born in Toronto and I grew up in Markham. I went to the University of Guelph, baptized as a Catholic as an infant. And then while I was at the University of Guelph, I sort of, as I say, heard a call perhaps from God to become a priest. And so there was a journey there. And then I joined what's called a religious community. And that's only relevant because actually we are part of the founding members of the University of Waterloo, actually. The University of Waterloo, it's still in the history that shows there's this picture with Father Cornelius Siegfried, Ira G. Needles, and someone else, I can't remember who it is. But it was a federation of colleges that got together to form the university. And so my community, it's called the Congregation of the Resurrection. We actually founded St. Jerome's University. Kind of a longer history because we started with a log cabin. You can still see it if you go out on Herb towards St. Agatha. There's a marker that has the place where the log cabin began. And it was just a schoolhouse for any Catholics who wanted to have their kids receive an education included, like, religious upbringing. And then that eventually led to what many people who grew up in this area in Kitchener-Waterloo knew as St. Jerome's High School, which now has kind of, I guess you could say, evolved into Resurrection High School, which actually I go and help out at every week, and St. Jerome's University. And so the whole idea for my community was part of our ministry is both parish ministry, so like in the local church community, but also education. So it was seen that, you just kind of, it would be natural to develop to all the different levels of education. Yeah, so that's, and then how I got involved with St. Jerome's actually is that, so over time, as we all know, the number of Catholic priests continues to decline. And so we were no longer able to run our institutions, but we tried to support them as we're able. And so I've been assigned to what's called vocation ministry. So I work with young people who are in that stage of their life thinking about what they want to do with their life, or perhaps even what God might be calling them to do with their life. And not necessarily becoming a priest or a nun or anything. And part of that work is to be involved with people in that age group, so high school, university, young adult. And it seemed to me to be a natural fit. Since St. Jerome's, we sort of founded it, and we still have a relationship with it, that I could be present to it. So I reached out, and Sean Hayes was starting at the exact same time that I started. So that's back in 2021. So this is my third year being involved with campus ministry at St. Jerome's.
So there are services that are held at St. Jerome's, and you conduct those services?
Yeah, so every Sunday at 7 p.m., we have a student mass. I mean, anyone's welcome to attend, but it's focused on, meeting the needs of students. And that's kind of like the staple, if you will. But then there's other things as well. There's like meditation on Monday evenings. There's various events that are happening throughout the year. A big fun one is Pancake Tuesday. So we just cook up, it's a big operation. We cook up tons of pancakes, just hand them out for free to people, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, food is always a winner for sure, especially
Yep.
with students.
Yep.
But yeah, I heard some of that story before, where they got together, and it was actually built before the bigger part of the university. So they were the beginning part of education here. It's good to know that when you look at universities around the country, a lot of them are still affiliated with the religious groups, and we've had a few here, like St. Paul's, which is now United affiliated, and a few of them. I think when I think about Western in London, there's a few of them associated there too. So I guess the religious communities thought about education a long time ago, and building spaces for that. That's part of history. So what do you think about things that have, since you've been here about 3 years, you've seen more Indigenous people throughout the university and more events that are happening, and you did attend the commitment ceremony. And I don't know, what are your thoughts about that? And I'm kind of alluding to our history, with Indigenous people, residential schools. There was always a hard part of our history, that still is coming to light through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But, the schools that had housed residential school and children being found, there's a whole different feeling in the country now about Indigenous people. So would that, I'm just trying to figure out how that plays into your mind, knowing the history and what's happening today, and you're part of it.
Yeah, very much. In fact, it coincides with the beginning of my time in vocation ministry. I got assigned to that June 2021, and as we all know, that was the summer. And I have to confess, like, fortunately, like many, maybe I shouldn't say, I'll just say for myself, I didn't know a whole lot about residential schools. I had heard about this Kairos blanket activity, which was offered in schools. It was never offered. I didn't have a chance to attend myself back when I was earlier in school, but I know it was going on in other places, and I heard about it. And I knew it had something to do with Indigenous things. And I did know just from Canadian news that, there's such a thing as reserves. And I thought to myself, well, why are there reserves when they were here before? But I didn't actually know a whole lot about residential schools. I'd never heard of the 60 scoop or anything. And then the summer hit, right? And I thought to myself, and it just really filled me with a lot of fear, to be honest. I had gone on a retreat because transitioning between, I'd just been ordained in 2019, so I'd only been a priest for a few years. And I was transitioning between ministry in church community to vocation ministry. And I thought a retreat would be good. So I went on the silent retreat actually up in Midland, and it's silent, so I'm not checking the news or anything. One day, I'm out for a walk, and I see across the street, there's this St. Marie among the Hurons, there's a sign, and then the flags were half-mast. I thought, okay, well, maybe someone historic died. Or maybe they found another, like, residential. It was actually the is it called Maryville? The one in, I think that's where Pope went for Masquechese, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that one. And I didn't know. I just thought, like, okay. So on a silent retreat, so the kind of like go on, it's you're silent, you pray, you take time to pray during the day, and you meet with the spiritual director once a day to talk about what's coming up in prayer. But since I'm a priest and my spiritual director was a priest as well, we also celebrated Mass together in the evening. And during Mass, there's a part in time where you can kind of spontaneously pray for whatever intentions. And he said, wanted to pray for all those who continue to be hurt by the recent, the next new discovery. And thought to myself, what's going on?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
and actually that retreat really helped me because I thought to myself, like at this time, our morale as Catholics is pretty low. Like many of us feel ashamed, especially that summer. Feel ashamed to be known to be a Catholic. Like how can you be part of this, whatever? And that's it, like let alone be the guy who's there to help people like discern a vocation. Like people don't want to be Catholic. Like definitely no one wants to be like a priest. And I honestly, I mean, this is my own sort of insecurities and stuff. I thought like they're gonna lynch me, right? And I don't blame them. But that retreat actually really helped me, and I was able to enter into to show up for the first time that fall at St. Jerome's without that kind of defensiveness, because I think that's the for many of us our initial response to fear is defensiveness, and naturally so, because like there's a threat, I'm about to be attacked, right? But we need to really understand that not all of our fears are founded, and maybe not the way that we think they are, right? And so that was kind of going on my mind, and over time, just having that sort of welcoming community helped me to kind of use things like they don't hate me.
Right.
And this is just like the Catholic students. I hadn't actually encountered any Indigenous people, but I have to say I'm very proud of the students at St. Jerome's and campus ministry. We're social justice is kind of overused, but yeah, like social conscience perhaps oriented, and I'm very proud of that. And so yeah, there are a lot of them are like we have concerns, we have questions, and like so do I. And over time, then I tried to educate myself more about the facts, right? Then I met other people actually although I help out at St. Jerome's, I live and help out at a church community here in town. And a number of the people there, I just come crossing paths with them. They gave me, that book, 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act? Someone gave me that. I helped out with a retreat, actually. And that summer, I was a workshop speaker, and I said, hey, are you guys planning on having anything on, like, the residential schools? I think, like, Catholic students probably want to know a bit about it. And they're like, well, we weren't planning to ask the guys. You seriously have to. And they're like, well, we don't know who to ask. I'm like, I'll do it. So then I had to educate myself. And so actually I reached out. Thankfully, I met two priests of Indigenous ancestry. I don't know if you've heard. There's this Father Cristino Bouvet. He was one of the priests who was kind of a consultant for organizing the Pope's trip. So he's of his Kokum, he's Cree.
Mhm.
So his Kokum was Cree, and I think he's out in Calgary, I believe. And then also, this is really shameful, his name escapes me, but this priest was in Ottawa area. But he recommended a book to me called The Ministry of Reconciliation, Spirituality and Strategies. And that really kind of helped frame for me thinking about, it was helpful to read the book because it was a little bit distanced from the actual events because it was written before these things, but it looked at real things, for example, like the dirty war in Argentina or the apartheid in South Africa, and looking at how like reconciliation actually pans out. And there were a lot of lessons from that I found helpful for me. And that kind of brings us to I don't know what to call it, the watch party.
Yeah,
Our
yeah,
event, yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
And that for me was a real experience of actually being part of that. And I have to say, I experienced nothing but, in terms of it personally, I experienced nothing but welcome and solidarity. And the Indigenous people who were there had all said, like they came with reservations that day. But for the most part, not all, for the most part, many of them were, I think one of them said, like, I'm perplexed, right?
Yeah.
But it had a sort of positive note. For example, although at that time the Pope didn't mention anything about Doctrine of Discovery, Terra Nullius, he did say, your people have been here since time immemorial. And he was saying, like, that's in effect what we're waiting, for people to recognize, not that they're waiting, but people ought to recognize. And from that point, I think it's just been a matter of my own kind of growing in, for example, I was not able to attend, they had a Lectures in Catholic Experience thing. I forget what day it was. It was in October. And Bishop Donald Bolin, who's from Diocese of Regina, I think he's the bishop there. He came down and talk about the kind of history of the Doctrine of Discovery. And then there was that recent statement from one of the Vatican dicasteries, or kind of like working committees, publicly stating this has never been part of Catholic teaching, and this was wrong, and then our participation in it was wrong, and we asking forgiveness and these kinds of things, and talking about how it was, at least how he's seen it been received, and kind of ways to move forward. And that's kind of, yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at. And
So you hit some key points there, and I think education is really the key to transforming the community of the history here, because we would talk about history a little bit different from what you've read in the books typically at school here. There's so many parts of it that I think was not really correct in a lot of ways, not accurate in a lot of ways, and I think we were able to keep a lot of those stories and The unfortunate part of that was that we weren't able to let people know about how we looked at history and the role that we played, here in Canada, just becoming a country based on partnership with Indigenous people and what we agreed to, through our treaties and our wampum belts. So I think the key thing is getting people to feel that history goes beyond what we understand it to be. And then when the religious communities came in, and this is something I kind of think about back in those days, is the Jesuit priests that came over. I think in their mindset, they didn't see a religion in Indigenous people. In fact, the way that they looked at religion. So I think maybe their first reaction would be that we didn't have a God or we didn't have practiced any of these types of honoring our Creator. But I think what they didn't see was that we did that every day with everything that we did, right from sunshine, sunrise ceremony, picking plants, so that we can have food, and hunting so that we can have sustenance. But all that came with thanking our Creator and for the life of those animals and plants that give themselves up for us. So I think that's really what they weren't seeing. And I think in their own mind, it had to been, well, we have to get some religion in these people to try to get them to find God, I guess, in the way that they understood it to be. So I think that's really, when I spoke to elders, they kind of felt the same way, but I guess because we didn't have a church to go to on Sunday, that was another indicator that we needed to have something. So I don't know if you've heard anything about that area or not, or you can reflect on that type of thought.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, again, I'm not most well read, but where I did my retreat actually it's called the Martyr Shrine in Midland, Ontario. There was for sure that kind of attitude of like, here are like quote unquote heathens, don't. But I don't think it's fair to paint them all with the same brush. Certainly, at least of the martyrs themselves, because beginning, of course, with Jean de Brebeuf, there's this thing called the Jesuit Relations. And I don't know, it's like 11, 14 volumes or something. It's the letters back and forth. And it must be neat, actually, to read through them and watch as John, who's writing most of these letters, is reflecting on his experiences. Because I think you'll probably see, again, I haven't read through all of them, but you'll probably see a kind of progression, his recognition of what's going on there. And so I would say for sure, we could say, but on the large part, that was perhaps the dominant attitude, which of course we would then see later on continuing. But I do think that there were individuals who did not see it that way and were trying to integrate things properly. And at least right now, I see it in a very positive way, especially I'm glad that Bishop Bowen was able to come here. It seems to me that the bishops in it's called Western Canada, it's really geographically ignorant. We call it the prairies, like Regina and area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Mhm.
plains, maybe.
Yeah.
They seem to have they seem to have worked on having a very good working relationship of walking together with Indigenous people and leaders. So they're for me like a model. And it seems to me they have a much better way of recognizing, for example, honoring the Creator. And I share that with university students, high school students. So at Resurrection High School where I help out at, I talk about how, every time I attend fire ceremony or something, really, I watch how like people who may not necessarily be themselves Indigenous or maybe have some different beliefs have no problem attending, and they see it as something we can actually do together. And I think that's a great model for our Catholic schools, because in this area, at least half of the student population in Catholic schools are not Catholic, and yet we have school masses. And so for me, the model, it's kind of like fire ceremony, like we can actually all be here together and participate respectfully. You don't have to believe everything we believe. And yeah, so for me, that's a kind of model. But actually, from my own background, I can perhaps offer a different perspective. So I'm Chinese, right? And certainly you've heard of Matteo Ricci, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
so when the Jesuits arrived in China, at least those ones, for a large part, did not subscribe to the idea that like, oh, here are people who don't know God and whatever. When they first arrived, they decided they would try and dress up like Buddhists, because they thought, well, here are religious figures, so we're going to present ourselves as religious figures, and then we'll enter into dialogue. But they're like, that's not really representative of what we believe, so they ended up dressing up as scholars. And Matteo Ricci, amazing man. Chinese people really respect memory. And he basically memorized Confucius forward and backwards. And he would just recite Confucius, like when they had kind of gatherings and stuff, he would recite Confucius backwards. And that amazed the Chinese people.
Good.
And because of learning, then they kind of got talking and stuff. And he never actually met the emperor, but he was actually allowed to go into the imperial compound and calibrate and kind of astronomical instruments that Chinese people had traded with Europeans to get, but didn't work. Now, people probably don't know this, but Matteo Ricci's background actually was mathematics. One of his mentors was actually a math person, a Jesuit who was a math professor, I guess. And he figured it out. It's like they're not working because they're calibrated for different latitude. Because like Europe is further north than China, so he recalibrated it, and it worked.
Wow.
And it was actually producing so they called him like the master of the West.
Okay.
But at the same time, what comes up soon after that is what's called the Chinese rites controversy. Whenever I say, people think I say Chinese rice controversy. It's not rites. It's rites, like
Okay.
rituals, rites,
Yeah.
right? So actually, but at this time, because as a result of the kind of Reformation in Europe, both Catholics and Protestants kind of doubled down on their kind of identities and stuff, and so the church at the time had considered actually having services, having mass in local languages, but they thought at this time we need to keep it as it is. It's going to confuse people. So mass was in Latin, of course, right? Now the Jesuits in China actually had the mass actually translated in Chinese, ready to go, and I think they were actually in some places celebrating it already. But then there were others, and I'm not trying to like point fingers, but there was other religious orders in China who were present, and they thought this is problematic, and this is we need to make them behave exactly the way we behave, and so this controversy got back to the Pope, and again, unsurprisingly, like has happened here, no Chinese people were consulted or brought into the discussion. It was just between Jesuits and these other religious, and basically the Pope sided with this other group, and then the Pope said that Catholics in China may not participate in ancestor veneration. And up until this time, the emperor, I don't know who it was at the time, looked pretty favorably on the Jesuits and the Christians and stuff. They were doing okay, and they got the astrolabe working. Like that's pretty cool. Like we're happy with that. Very respectful people. But in Chinese culture, at least, things are shifting now, of course. But the highest virtue is respect for elders, like above everything. Actually, there are, I think it's less so now, but there are actually lawsuits of parents suing their children for not taking care of them.
Wow.
Can you
Wow.
imagine that would happen here?
Wow.
But it's because there's that
Yeah,
expectation,
of
right?
course.
And so for the emperor, it was like, are you kidding me? Like, that is ridiculous. Like, this is the most un-Chinese thing. This is an immoral thing, right? And so at that point, basically, the emperor's like, all of you out. So all the missionaries were basically kicked out. And it came a long period of suffering for the Chinese Catholics who did choose to remain. Many left the church, but they did remain. And this is kind of, for me, the history of the church, and maybe every community, that our communities do make mistakes, and how to journey forward in light of that, right? So later on, much later on, Pius XII, so this is like 1940s or so. By this time, there's actually a few native-born Chinese bishops already now. And obviously, they've consulted and everything. And he issues, I don't know if it was a papal bull, but it was like a governance document, similar way, called Plane Compertum, and saying very clearly that basically, like, formerly we didn't understand what was involved with the ancestor veneration rites. And so now that we have a better understanding, we say it is definitely okay. In fact, it is a praiseworthy and good thing that the Chinese faithful may participate in these rites, as long as it's not like worshiping as deities. Right? There were some areas where that kind of did happen, but by and large, it's not what's going on. And not only that, not only venerating ancestors, they could also participate in veneration of Confucius, who is not a Christian. Right? And so it just, in my mind, here's an example of at least a positive thing on the Jesuits, right? They were
Okay.
right all along in this case, and how the church, again, this is a matter of governance, not teaching, which is kind of one of the difficulties I think people have when we hear the term doctrine of discovery, and Bishop Bowman mentioned that. But this is an issue of governance, and the infallibility that we believe that the church has does not apply to governance. Like, the church can make and does make wrong governance decisions and should correct them when we hopefully learn from our mistakes, right? So does that kind of provide a little bit of perspective on the?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about when you were speaking was the translation of a religion, in a sense, where you get different determinations of what that translation means, and that's what I've seen in history, like we all translate it a little bit different. I think that's what causes the different denominations. Maybe they're things, because it comes from the same book, right? The Bible is, I guess, the founding piece, in a sense, in how they interpret that. In my mind, I always think about, like, when indigenous people think about creator, it's we were brought to this earth with all humanly unified needs. We need food and water, for survival. And when I think of, this might be totally incorrect, or how you think, but even beyond the religious part of how we are, those needs are paramount. And that's where unity can come back, by getting back to our lowest common denominator as a species on this earth that requires the rest of the world. And I think that's why indigenous people look at water as sacred, as the air needs to be clean, and we make sure our mother, the earth, is treated with all respect. And then out of that, I think we started growing from different ways of determining how we want to praise our creator somehow. So I don't know if that's right or wrong, in that sense, but the main part of this is we need to keep this land healthy. And I think that's something that most people agree about. Not everybody, because look how we're treating the water and look what, what's going on with climate change today. Politically, we have different views on that. But I think if you want to go to science, it's so absolute that we need to have these things for survival. So getting back to that as a root, maybe that can help us draw together. And I think that's what those fires mean, when you come to visit and see an indigenous ceremony. It's getting to that point where we can actually embrace everybody's thoughts, but finding that denominator, which is something Creator made us all very clear what we need to do. And so I think that's where I'd kind of like to get people to think about. And then however you choose to, honor Creator or God, this will kind of be the unifying point. Does that make any sense to you?
For sure, for sure. Actually, and again, I've had opportunity to reflect on this as I've participated a little in these things. I think one of the great gifts of any genuine encounter is that, the other, we both receive something from it. And I think certainly, in my opinion, in the West, we've become very disconnected from physical reality. Like, and I think we would agree that not only do we need to respect the land, that we are part of the land. I'm sure you would agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
And one of the beautiful things for me, I came to realize that a lot of religion and people's thoughts about spirituality is very disconnected, actually. It's very much kind of like concepts and things like this. And one thing I've come to appreciate about my own faith, like Catholicism, is actually very tactile. You mentioned water. Like, so in almost every church, when you go in, there's holy water, right? It's the reminder of our baptism. So people are touching water and like blessing themselves with it. All the sacraments involve tactile things. For the Eucharist, there's bread, wine, right? And we actually, and I don't know if you ever attended a mass actually, but during the preparation, there's this prayer. It said, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, for through your goodness we have this bread to offer, with which earth is given and human hands have made. It will become for us the bread of life." There's this recognition. And the really cool thing is that, so I remember I was once helping out, it was a summer volunteering. I was just working, actually gardening with some students. I was a student myself, and one of them had commented on how they, in high school, like they had a smudge ceremony. They're so excited and everything, and they said, and then, yeah, because Catholicism was not their native religion. And I said, but it's not anyone's native religion, right? And then sometimes we certainly think, from perhaps from an indigenous perspective or even an Asian perspective, like, it's like the religion of like white people. No, actually, it came from like it was a Semitic religion, right? Even for them, it wasn't their native religion. And the beautiful thing is that, as you said, this lowest common denominator, that's actually what we believe. Like, we believe God, the creator, sent his son, Jesus, into, and this will be about incarnation, into the lowest common denominator to become one of us. And in a sense, part of the land, right? There's this beautiful line in one of Paul's letters. He says, all creation is groaning, waiting for the freedom of the children of God. And so basically, it's recognition that the children of this earth are actually part of this earth, and we're actually all waiting for this kind of healing, this restoration to come from. Yeah. So for sure, I definitely agree with that. And I think there's a lot more to be said about, for example, ritual, right? Because, we can talk about things, but being able to enter into a ritual, we kind of engage in things differently, right? And obviously, we also have fire, we have incense, we have smoke, right? All these things. Yeah. So I would definitely say that these things are points of contact, and which can help us, I think, not just come back into contact with the land, but who we are. And that's one of the great gifts, I think, of interaction between the Catholic Church as well with indigenous communities, is that I think you have a very good hold you've retained, despite many attempts to remove it, right? Of your relationship, your connection with the creator and with yourselves, and for all the, sophistication, quote unquote, that, people think they've accomplished, how in touch are we with ourselves? Like, I mean, the numbers of people who are not perhaps people just didn't know that they needed help before, but like therapists are overbooked all the time, right? And obviously mental health is a very wide topic, but certainly I think there are elements in which it's because we're not in touch with who we are, with our relationships with each other, with the creator, with the land, that some of our problems definitely come from. So yeah, this is definitely very, very much related.
Hmm. And I was wondering when you see like a commitment from like an institution, what we did here with the president, and we had a group of people there. How do you think about that when we bring creator into those scenarios? Like they're not like religious moments that we think about when we want to talk to our God or our creator. They're what we did when we signed treaties and had understandings of wampum belts. That creator was part of that. And so we bring that into that ceremony to make a commitment, for something that we do humanly on this earth. I was always wondering about that, from maybe your point of view. Do you see that to be fit to be able to bring creator into those types of scenarios?
Yeah. So, Mike, I got to say, I'm a little jealous actually. So, because of the baggage, all the terrible things the Catholic Church has done over the years. If we say God, people are like, ugh, they roll their eyes and stuff. But if you say Creator, everyone's like, oh yes, Creator. Right? And and really, I think it's the courage to identify those relationships. It's kind of like if you have a family member, right? Perhaps other people have an issue with, but you are willing to, in a sense, kind of take the hit, so to speak, to represent, yeah, you know what, I do have a relationship with this person. And so I think it's 100%, not just, is it a good thing? I think it's a necessary thing. Again, obviously, but I certainly believe that it's essential for our mental health in terms of relationships to actually have that relationship with God, creator, whatever term we're going to use. And so for you to actually bring that into the public sphere, I think is, I mean, I applaud you because the whole like secular thing is that like, oh yeah, religion is your private hobby. If that makes you feel better, yeah, you can do that, right? But when these people attend, fire ceremonies, I don't think the majority of them think that. They're actually open to something here, and so I applaud you. I thank you. I'm a little bit jealous, but yeah, I think it's not just appropriate. I think it is the way forward. And again, it's a lot of this kind of religious baggage from how the way people have suffered
Right.
really over the past. That there's this kind of, you want to talk about God, I don't want to talk about that, right? But we all have this. Whether we believe in God or not, we have a relationship with God, right? And I think even among Catholics, they have people, they'll talk like, oh yeah, yeah, I believe in God, whatever, right? But they don't really think, and I was like this one time too. They don't really think about having a real relationship. But I'm pretty sure you'd be hard pressed to find an Indigenous person who, from a young age, unless they were completely taken away from all this, right? So growing up with their traditions at all from a very young age, as long as they can remember, knows that they have a relationship with the Creator. Okay, I think it'd be hard pressed to find someone who didn't, right?
I think that's inept, with all indigenous people, even if you didn't practice, our spirituality in any sense, you knew that there's something about the land and creator that, allowed us to be who we are. And I don't know, even people who are incarcerated, they find this is their way to talk to creator somehow, you know, and I've seen people addicted, like that's where they turn when they want to change. They want to go to our spiritualness. So you've been seeing medicine wheels kind of displaced around a little bit, and there's some in optometry and there's some here now. We're going to see more around the university, but it's not that everybody follows that same mythology of that. But if you look at the spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical side of what that means, and I remember working on a street patrol program in Toronto where people had given up on life. They just had opted out of the society. Addiction came into their life. Thoughts of ending their life, was pretty regular. And when we went to meet them, most of the times we would connect them through spirituality. Like if it's just a smudging ceremony, which, oh, I really need this today. It's just so important for me. And then you move a little forward into, maybe we'd like to ask creator to help us or something like that. Everybody's different, but the spiritual side, I think, is the door in to many people. Even if you've given up on everything, that's probably the last course. And whenever I think about somebody going through challenges in life and you've omitted your spiritualness, it's almost forced upon you when you lose a loved one or when things are hard for you, you end up being spiritual in a sense. And that's how I think we're able to reach people, even if they were addicted and they were into, a very crucial moment of their life that way, they reach that way. So I think that's why it's so important. I think it's in all of us, whether we choose to live that way or not. I think we all turn there sometime. And I think that's where the religions across the world can, like you were mentioning, the water and examples of similarities that happened, because I think it all came from creator at one time anyway. I think the thought of how did it work with Creator, as humans start to form on this earth, we were all given those same set of instructions. Keep the water clean, think about our Creator, and try to live a good life. And those standards, I think, is what can help us ultimately come back, to a space where we can actually unify again in this world. Politics have changed things. We've been separated through various reasons and thoughts, but I think the unifying factor will always be that spiritual side of it. So I really, appreciate you bringing that up because I've been to various churches throughout Mennonite churches and other sectors. I even got invited to the Muslim community. They took me over to England to speak at their Jalsa out there, which had about 50,000 Muslims. And I thought I did something wrong. I told them that we were having a Sundance ceremony, which is a time to heal. And I said, we usually stand up and talk to our Creator that way and give our tobacco. And the Muslims do it a little bit different. They stay on their knees when they talk to Creator. And so I sang them a song that we would sing at a ceremony, and all these Muslims stood up. And I thought it was kind of interesting because I didn't see them stand up through that whole thing. And when we finished, the person that came and helped me with that, I said, I hope I didn't offend them by telling them that we stand up and made them stand up. They said, no, we did it because that's what you do. And we want to be a part of what you do. And he said that was the first time it ever happened. So that's why I kind of felt a little awkward. I said, well, I hope I didn't do nothing wrong. But that shows you the extreme that people want to learn and to build this together. So I've been fortunate, to be able to hear different religions and different thoughts, and I try to find that unifying factor, and that's what you mentioned, by using the water and the incense, because we smudge, and it's funny because at universities and public buildings they don't let you smudge, right? So I said, well, people do it with incense, and it's always been a part of who we are, so I don't know if you have any indigenous people come to your services or not, but like a lot of times they would be interested in having a smudge while the ceremony is going on. And are you open to that or?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. So I'll start where what I do know is that I know that certainly parishes, there are parishes in Canada which are actually primarily Indigenous communities. In fact, the Pope visited one of them. I honestly can't remember, but it was damaged by a fire recently. I don't know if you remember it, and they rebuilt it. And actually, the structure of the sanctuary is like a teepee. You've seen a
Mhm.
picture of it, yeah.
Okay.
And actually, the tabernacle, that's where we put the Eucharist, where we believe Jesus is present to us through that. It's in the shape of a teepee. Actually, and so you
Okay.
open, yeah, and actually, it's the words above the sanctuary are, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." But actually, in the Greek, it's pitched his tent among us. So it's kind of neat. Yeah. So I know for sure, and certainly in those things, it was very public that smudge was involved, was part of integrated in that. Catholic public worship is rather, at least for Mass, at least, it's a usual quote unquote Sunday service. It's fairly regulated. I mean, there are definitely options and things we can incorporate. But yeah, so I'm sure it can be done. I just need to figure out where exactly it would fit. Yeah, I mean, you could use it certainly. I know there's actually at least one Catholic bishop of Indigenous descent. I think his name is Bishop Murray Chatelain. Have you heard of him? Yeah. And anyways, so I know it can be done. We don't really know how here. As far as I know, at St. Jerome's, we don't have any Indigenous students who have actually identified themselves as such to me. But I do know actually campus minister who's helping out over at the John Paul II Student Center across the street at St. Michael's.
Okay.
He is of Métis descent, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So actually, when he attended the Karawas blanket activity in his sharing, it was rather emotional for him because his grandfather was Métis.
So we kind of talked about history and today. What about going forward? Like you've seen within the 94 calls to action, a call to religious communities and how they're going to maybe build reconciliation, within their way of services and things like that. Is there been any thought to that? Or, now that we know the history and it wasn't very nice, but what are we going to do in the future? Like consulting First Nation people is probably a good thing because there's still a lot of resistance, to religion. Residential school wasn't that far away, and families that are still affected today are still having, a bad relationship with religions. And I know that's pretty prominent in many communities, but, some have adopted it. I wouldn't have known my grandfather unless he found the church. He lived a pretty rough life, but the church came and probably added 20 years to his life. So I was able to get to know him. So, those are stories that I find to be very important. But the thing about going forward, that's really, I don't know if we've devised that yet, how or maybe we're still working through that and how we can incorporate more indigenous thoughts and ideas into not just your religion, but other religions here. Is there any thought or idea, or is that something we need to explore more still?
Yeah, so although I said I wasn't able to attend the lecture that Bishop Bullen gave, I watched it. and and again, I just think the bishops in the plains are doing a great job. And he said they actually have a working principle there, and said that unfortunately he was not able to do it here. That the principle, nothing about us without us. I'm sure
Right.
you've heard that, right? And so every time they give some kind of presentation, he'll always have an indigenous person present with him. Unfortunately, it was the nature of his academic lecture didn't. Anyways, but I think he had a meeting actually with some indigenous representatives before that. So that thing is probably the first thing moving forward is to do that. And he said for too long it's been like, oh, we'll do something for you. Right? That's really condescending, patronizing, paternalizing, whatever. Yeah. Hopefully those days are over.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so stuff like I mean, even this, like I think this is good. It's and then again, this is another thing that we can learn certainly as a church, but even as a society from Indigenous people is the importance of relationships. Yeah, we do have to do things. We need to work out certain things, but let's start with the relationships, right? And it's from the relationships that we can actually have a stable place, if you will, to work on things. And so I would say first that the nothing about us without us. I would say that needs to definitely be cemented into. Or,
Well, I think that's really why I'm at the university right now, is because I was a chief of my nation and I've done a lot of work, in various capacities. But my mind is getting young people to know this generation of professionals so that they learn it's equated to all of this is going to make you a better person by knowing things, right? And then you can go out and change. They use it, decolonizing systems that are in place, through all these different professions. A lot of them were built to exclude certain people, minorities, indigenous people included. So now, if this generation gets to know the true history and they see the values that this institution is built on, then they leave here, with that knowledge that things need to change in this country. The Human Living Index that I reference from time to time shows the gap of living standards between Indigenous and non Indigenous people. And those treaties were never meant to have a gap. They were meant to live equally by sharing the resources, by being, respective of each other's ways of being. But I think once the resources were identified, it became evident that they didn't care about treaties or anything. They just wanted to take the land and the resources that are here, and ultimately pushing Native people, to almost extinction levels. The government was afraid to use the word genocide within the Murdered Missing Women report, but they've now come to claim that it was an act of genocide, against Indigenous people. So I think that's why that gap is something that we can work on. It's something that people can see, and a reason why we need to do this. So I'm trying to push that along, in this institution, who's accepted a lot of that. We got a ways to go yet, but in society, if we, and when I said I was a chief, I worked with Trudeau's and I worked with different, MPs, and it's a hard rock to move, because their thoughts is more on everything else. But what I did decide was maybe I can reach into that next generation, and that's why the young minds here, I think, is so open now to understanding things that in fact, they're even angry, when they find out what they weren't taught before. I taught a class here called Reconciliation in Health, and those students were just wanting to absorb that. They said, how come we didn't know these things? And now you get Indigenous students who are waking up to the fact that their grandmas and grandpas were died young by suicide or alcohol abuse or residential school effects. And they're angry. So at our recommitment ceremony, I posed that question to the president. I said, what if we have students here now that show behavioral issues because of what they learned? Do we just omit them? I don't, that's a hard one to answer, but it definitely is a reality of today. Now that young people are standing up, that's why you're seeing land backs and you're seeing, I'm not taking it no more. My grandparents were passive. I'm not going to be passive anymore. I'm going to fight and demand for our rights. And so this is the kind of generation we're moving into now. And I would just say, even in the religious world, you're going to see some people who totally are offended by, the religious world because of what happened to their grandparents. So that's the work that we got to do. The people who believe similar to us, they're not the ones who, well, we need to work on everybody, but at least they're coming along. It's the ones who totally oppose the religious world and society and colonized systems. We got to find a way to intertwine and build a relationship somehow. So that's the tough part about, I think, what we're doing now. And we got to, I don't know if there's an answer, that we can say yet, but we got to work on it together somehow.
I think for me, one of the hopeful things is to see that with the institutions and individuals themselves are showing signs of change, people are actually open. They don't necessarily, not necessarily come back, but at least stop ignoring you, right? They're willing to enter that relationship. And so for me, I'm pretty convinced across the board, at least in Canada, the majority, if not all the Canadian bishops, this is a priority, and they are kind of interested in this. And certainly among the young Catholics that I know, the majority of them are actually also interested in this. And myself, and there's something different when it's one thing for an indigenous person to point out that this was hurtful for us and these things. It's another thing for a leader within your own community, like let's say the Catholic community, like a bishop. Like Bishop Bowen said this as he's going through some of the texts of papal bulls. He's like, "You're going to feel angry, and that's a good thing," right? So to have someone within the group, because the difficulty is, I mean, anyone can jettison, their ties and whatever, and say that was all bad. That's all bad. I'm just going to start new. But as you know, even in indigenous communities, like that's not a way forward. You have to have a relationship with those who went before you, your ancestors. And you have to integrate. I mean, obviously, if there are bad things, you leave those behind, but you can't just cut off those relationships. So for me, one of the hopeful things moving forward is that within the Catholic Church, it seems to me that there is this, especially the Pope taking the leadership, like leading by example, that all of us can actually work on that on our side. And I think that helps with the encounter when we meet together.
Well, anyway, I think we had a good discussion here, and I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and views and listening to what my experience is. And it's been an honor to have you come to the show. Nish Vibes is, like I said, open to conversations that I think sometimes need to be had, and we express that to people who listen. So I want to make sure that they know that our friendship and theories and ideas, may differ sometimes, but we can still get along in this world in a good way. You're a human that needs water, air, and so am I. And I think this is where I think we'd like to expose to our younger generation. So I want to say thank you. If there's any closing comments that you might have, please go ahead and share.
I just again want to thank you for the opportunity. To be honest, I was kind of afraid coming on. Like, I don't want to misrepresent, I don't want to offend. But I thank you for your welcome as always. It's always been my experience with you, and yeah, and actually some of the things that you've said have sort of helped for me. Again, it's like it's one thing for me to think these things, but to hear an Indigenous person say like that, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of reinforcing some of the things that I'm kind of coming to discover. Like for example, that importance of being in touch with nature and the creator and relationships, and these things for me are priorities. And how do I integrate that in my own in my own faith as well?
Miigwech, in our language, we say Chimiigwech means thank you very much. And we hope to see you back at Nish Vibe someday. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll see you again.